We enter now into our first panel discussion, and our moderator for that is Cindy Tugwell, who you've met before. The topic is economics, financial sustainability, and partnerships, and I will turn this chair literally over to Cindy.
Good morning. I will be moderator for all our panelists in this segment, and this segment is very important to me because of the economics and sustainability is really critical to all of our heritage organizations going forward. So I won't delay. I'm excited with our panel of panelists, and Angela Mathieson is first up. Angela is the president and CEO of CentreVenture Development Corporation, an arm's-length agency of the City of Winnipeg, mandated to provide leadership in planning, coordination, and implementation of redevelopment projects. And interestingly enough, it was started 20 years ago in 2000 by former Mayor Glenn Murray, and they have invested in over 160 downtown revitalization projects, leveraging over $1 billion. So without further ado, we'd like to take it over to Angela.
Thanks, Cindy. Just checking you can all hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So Cindy asked us on this panel to talk about the economics and financial sustainability and partnerships, and specifically asked the question, how can heritage facilities be financially sustained in an uncertain future? That's kind of a big topic. And as the head of Winnipeg's Downtown Development Agency, I've been thinking a lot lately about how the entire downtown will be sustained through these uncertain times. But I'm glad to have been prompted to think specifically about heritage buildings, because in doing so, I realized that we do have some unique challenges with respect to these facilities when compared to other buildings in Winnipeg. But we've also built a fairly resilient foundation, I think, of adaptive reuse over the last 20 years, which I think should hold us in good stead, and I think also provides us with a few lessons going forward. So first I'll talk about the challenge, and I'm going to talk specifically from the perspective of commercial buildings, because that's generally what we deal in. So there's many others in other heritage and cultural sectors here. And we really need to start in the year like that Cindy noted, which was when CentreVenture was formed in 2000. And that our heritage building inventory at the time in the downtown, the majority were either vacant, severely dilapidated, or either existing or renovated into what we call Class C office space, really with fairly marginal tenancies and very low rents. And in fact, the majority of our Class C office space in downtown Winnipeg is in heritage facilities. And this type of space is especially vulnerable during slow economic times to high vacancies. And obviously this is more acute during this pandemic. And that's because these buildings are primarily occupied by small businesses and nonprofits, those most at risk of closure during a disruptive period like this. So, when we look at the issue of conversion to office space, it is of a commercial heritage building that's inherently less sustainable and subject to swings in the market. And this is reflected to a large extent on the degree to which the owners of these buildings in our downtown are prepared to invest in upkeep and heritage preservation. And simply put, these buildings just don't have the revenue foundation for the kind of capital injection required to give them, another 100 years of life. So as I understand, I've been with CentreVenture for only 5 years now, but when we were formed in 1999, our early investments in heritage buildings in the downtown were primarily in the form of small preservation grants to support mostly at that time operating office buildings. So things like brick repointing, window repairs, building facade upgrades, that kind of thing. And this was after a fairly long period of disinvestment, so I think that was seen as very positive for the sector. But I think within the organization, and perhaps more broadly, there was a fairly early recognition that this kind of support, this kind of partnership was inherently unsustainable with commercial heritage buildings. And so long as these buildings don't have the revenue base sufficient to maintain them, this type of grant support would be continually called upon. And at CentreVenture, we couldn't afford that, and governments probably couldn't sustain that. We've already talked a lot in this session about government support. So this really started our organization's shift in our thinking about how we would invest and where we would invest, and really with the goal of looking at preserving these buildings with a long view. So we began targeting vacant and highly underutilized buildings and promoting project proposals that would see a dramatic shift to more sustainable uses that would weather economic up and downs. And this was primarily institutional and residential, I should say, and we also did advocate quite strongly for some institutional uses such as Red River College's fairly new downtown campus. And when we were, designing our programs to support, we really were looking at how do we put these buildings on a solid footing with appropriate ratios of equity and debt, and with cash flows sufficient to support proper maintenance and preservation, and refinancing capacities in the future to make major capital upgrades. So for CentreVenture, our focus really shifted from looking at specific heritage buildings and some heritage elements of buildings and supporting those. We really got into supporting significant adaptive reuses, and our support increased accordingly. So heritage in some ways became secondary or corollary to our mission, which was to ensure that these important buildings had solid and sustainable uses. And I'm pleased to say that over the last 20 years, over $400 million of private capital investment has gone into over 70 heritage buildings in the downtown. About 60% of that has been in the residential and a further 10% in the institutional sector. And really that balance being in smaller scale retail commercial building improvements throughout the downtown, really resulting from a general upswing in people's confidence in the downtown. At CentreVenture, we've been a part in small ways in the majority of those projects, either through land assemblies, second mortgage financing, equity investments, or grants. But I will say that the most significant factor, and really the game-changing partnership to protect heritage in downtown Winnipeg, was the establishment of both municipal and provincial property tax increment financing. And that support really is responsible for unlocking dozens and dozens of underutilized buildings and converting them primarily into residential uses, projects like the James Avenue Pumping Station, District Lofts, Bell Hotel, and many, many others. And it was a very sustainable form of support as well, requiring really nothing out of pockets for governments. These were really opportunity costs. And these are buildings that produce little or no taxes. And so that tax increment financing, which for people who don't know about it, really a rebate of the new taxes that you generate when you redevelop a property, that's rebated back and for 10 to 15 years, really allowed these projects to finance themselves on a lower risk basis. And after that increment period, they start paying full taxes, really literally after a century, half a century in many cases of sitting vacant. And so they become sustainable, tax-paying properties, but also properties with the capacity long-term to support and to be good stewards of their heritage status. So that support is no longer available, which presents a challenge for the remaining significantly underutilized heritage buildings in the downtown. And luckily, we can count those buildings on a couple of hands. Cindy and I have had some recent conversations about a couple of very important ones. So at CentreVenture, we've started to be a bit more surgical, I guess, in terms of targeting those buildings. And I'd like to speak about a recent partnership on a block of heritage buildings on Princess Street at Rupert Avenue. Some of you may know about the project because one of the buildings was severely damaged halfway through the renovation and had to be demolished. And that was the Scott Memorial Building, which was heartbreaking really for all those involved because it was well nearing completion. But when we bought there's a number of buildings next to that building, but when we bought the buildings, we felt they were very strategic in an area of downtown where we're currently focusing our business plan in really around the the public safety building redevelopment. They were being used for furniture storage, so we approached the owner and with some persuasion, we purchased the buildings. And our team put together a feasibility plan for their adaptive reuse into residential. And one of the challenges we had was the main floor retail storefronts, which were really quite beautiful. But again, it goes back to this concept of trying to find sustainable uses for our heritage buildings. And we really felt that retail uses on the main floor would not be sustainable in that location. But we had been working with a number of arts organizations that were very tenuous occupancy and really substandard occupancy in the exchange districts. And one of those was ACE Art, a contemporary artist-run center. They're over 25 years old. So we started looking for program support to help them accomplish a sustainable occupancy on the main floor of the building, and then there would be residential above. And we're very grateful to have had tremendous financial support from Canadian Heritage Cultural Spaces Program towards their space. And I'd also like to thank Rick Frost, who I think is on this call, and the Winnipeg Foundation, who has been a very important partner in that project as well. So we pulled that main floor together. We went out, we found a private sector joint venture partner, Mr. Mark Liziak, who's a heritage developer. He assumed the construction risk and he'll own the residential component. CentreVenture will own the main floor space to defray that commercial risk for him, and we anticipate that project will open in 2021. It was a very complex public-private partnership and financial structure that took us nearly 3 years to accomplish just the start of construction. So it really isn't something that we can replicate on a continual basis. We just simply don't have the resources within our organization to do it very many more times, although we might try 1 or 2 more. So I really think I would be remiss, especially being followed by the Associate Clerk of the Executive Council, to say that one of the things that CentreVenture would love to work with Heritage Winnipeg on and the provincial government in partnership to look back to the concept of using tax increment financing for residential development, and specifically targeted at those remaining heritage buildings that we know are really in the danger of going past that point of no return unless we can come up with some long-term sustainable uses. So my message today most certainly is about the uses. It's about what we're doing with these buildings that's terribly important. And while converting these buildings to residential uses has been more expensive, say, than office uses, with support from CentreVenture and tax increment financing, that economic gap has been narrowed to make those projects feasible, for immediate occupancy. And more importantly, it makes these buildings higher long-term contributors to the tax base, but also with the ability to regenerate themselves regardless of economic cycles or major disruptions like the pandemic that we're living through right now. And I'll just close there.
Thank you very much, Angela. That was an amazing presentation. No one knows more than Heritage Winnipeg and myself, working with you over the years, how important the work that CentreVenture does, not only to help rehabilitate and to bridge some financing, but to make positive change in our downtown, and you've committed to that. So thank you very much, Angela, for your presentation today. Our next speaker, or panelist, pardon me, is from the province of Manitoba, Elliot Sims. Elliot is an associate clerk of the Executive Council for Legislative and Regulatory Affairs in Manitoba, in the Manitoba government. In his role, he coordinates the regulatory development and consultation process across government and serves as secretary to the Regulatory Accountability Cabinet Committee. That is a mouthful. It sounds like a very important role, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation, Elliot.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Cindy, and for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm going to try and share my screen, and let me know if it's coming up properly, because I do have a few slides to add to my presentation. Okay. There, is that showing up properly on your screen?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Great, thank you. So I really appreciate being on this panel and being able to provide that look at government and how what our role is when it comes to participating in the both the preservation and the promotion of heritage and heritage facilities within the province. I think Angela, just to build on one of her points to begin with, we've heard a lot about sports, culture, and heritage and the historic resources branch throughout the morning. But I think it's important, as Angela mentioned, that there's other issues and other policy issues throughout government that can have just as big an impact on the heritage sector, particularly when you're looking at taxes, that aren't always in the historic resources branch. So we need to always think about, as government, what's that holistic approach of how all the departments are working together to promote heritage. So I'll delve into that a little bit here. And of course, Minister Cox earlier today provided a very strong overview of her work and the government's work for sports, culture, and heritage to support the sector. So when we're talking about partners and historic facilities, how many do we have or where are they, I think is an important part and an important place to start. So let me see if I'm not right here. There we go. So Manitoba right now has about 800, almost 900 historic, designated historic sites that have been designated as such either by the province or by municipalities through the Historic Resources Act. And then you've also got the City of Winnipeg, which has their own bylaw, which allows them to designate heritage buildings. So over the course of the 21st century, we've actually seen almost a doubling, 80% increase in the number of heritage facilities in Manitoba. As you look at that, the real increases has been at the local level of government. So there's a lot more properties that Manitobans have chosen through their elected officials to protect. And then we need to look at how do we actually promote saving them and providing those resources when you look at some of the ownership structures of them, where those resources might not be available to attract those millions of dollars in capital reinvestment that Angela was talking about earlier. So when we look at who owns them, who are these partners we need to work with, we broke it out in terms of provincial and municipally designated sites versus City of Winnipeg, because you're seeing there's a real split between the urban and rural ownership structure. So in the City of Winnipeg, particularly in the downtown, you've got nearly 60% of the buildings are owned by the private sector. 18% are owned by nonprofits of one sort or another. 12% are owned by municipal governments, and 13% are private. So when we talk about that, that means a private individual, usually a home residence, rather than an incorporated entity. In rural Manitoba, it's quite a bit different, where you've got nearly half of them are owned by NGOs and only 15% by businesses. So that shows that we have to have programs and supports that allow all different types of ownership structures to benefit and to preserve that history. I will note as well, because someone might ask, well, from this slide, how come there's no provincial historic sites in Winnipeg? Well, there are, but they're provincially designated so that they would fall under the pie chart on the left rather than on the right. So of that 2%, some of them, of the provincial ones, are actually in Winnipeg. Of course, I'm actually sitting in one of them right now in the legislative building. So when we talk about how do we support them going forward, as the minister mentioned this morning, Manitoba did release their new cultural policy and action plan. The first one since the mid-90s. It was initiated in 2017 and released in 2019. And there were 2 or 3 things that really talk to the importance of heritage facilities. First, the first priority, obviously, fostering economic development. How do we continue to use those buildings in a way that encourages the economy to keep growing and to use it as a way to keep growing? How do we, and then we jump to 4 and 5 being the other 2 priority areas that really talk about heritage buildings. Supporting culture and communities in everyday life, making sure that these facilities are still part of our everyday lives and we do have that connection to them. And then of course, modernizing the cultural funding program. So making sure that when we do want to support those buildings, that owners and interested individuals can access that funding in a fast and easy to use way. So listening to what Manitobans have said about that, government has taken a new approach, new partnerships, specifically with the Winnipeg Foundation, and to use a different type of funding mechanism for heritage, which will be here, as their motto is, for good forever, hopefully. And we need to make sure that we have funding sources that are available to match that need. So while not all of them are specifically towards heritage buildings per se, all of them do impact that increase to support them. So as the minister mentioned, over the last 2 years, government has invested about $32 million into endowment funds through Manitoba's Community Foundation Network to provide consistent, sustainable, and inflation-protected funding to support heritage in the province. When you look at the long-term grant assistance for all heritage out of the Historic Resources branch over the last 20 years, so in the 21st century, that's the equivalent of about 22 years worth of spending that have been brought in from general revenues to support the heritage sector overall. Of course, the two that are the most important when you're talking about built heritage, heritage resources conservation, which the minister mentioned this morning, replaced the designated heritage building program, and the military memorials conservation, which does the same thing for a subset of those programs. As well, we've got the Signature Museum Sustainability Trust. Many of those 7 signature museums also maintain municipal or provincially designated buildings. And the Heritage Trust Program, which supports all heritage organizations, if they apply for it, across the province, whether they have built infrastructure or are more on the research side of it. And I would note as well, on the Heritage Trust Program, the strong support of the Winnipeg Foundation to help utilize that program to support capacity building in the heritage sector. From my count now, 4 out of the 8 provincial heritage agencies have actually maximized their funding through the initial program parameters through that program, largely due to the vision of the Winnipeg Foundation. So I thank Rick and the board of directors and staff for that real strong support for the sector going forward. So that money will generate about $1.5 million every year to support built heritage and heritage overall. Some of it will be replacing some existing programs, and I'll get into that in a second. But aside from that, when we're talking about it, government also recognizes the need to support our own heritage that we own as a government on behalf of the people of Manitoba. And I think nothing speaks stronger to that reinvestment than the recent commitment in legislation to restore the Manitoba Legislative Building. The government committed $150 million over the next 15 years to restore the building. It is 100 years old, and it does need that renovation and adaptation to still be a 21st century public space. And then to also, not only after that restoring, but making sure we're maintaining that capital investment so we don't get into the state that the building is currently in. And so those are other steps that, again, outside of sort of the core of the Historic Resources Branch in Sport, Culture, and Heritage, are ways that government is supporting heritage in the province. So what does that mean overall? So from a NGO perspective, over the last 20 years, so far in the 21st century, the provincial grant assistance from Historic Resources Branch has been about $1.475 million every year. So that was through the Heritage Grants Program, the Community Grants Program, and the Designated Heritage Building Fund is sort of the 3 pillars of the program. When you look at the new endowment assistance that's coming in, that's going to inject another $923,000 annually into heritage grants for the sector in the province. So a 62% increase, which is significant, obviously. Now, I'll warn, not all of this flows sort of through government. Some of these will be flowing directly to heritage agencies, so it won't look like that necessarily on public accounts when you look at it from government, but it is that vision and that support that has created those funds. So when we look at what that means, starting actually today, due to the way the endowments work, we're seeing for the first time in a long time a significant growth in grant support for these types of facilities, specifically for these types of facilities and the organizations that run them. So it's going to be the highest that, by a long shot, that the heritage sector has seen in the 21st century. So I think I'll leave it there.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Elliot. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of all the PHAs to thank the province of Manitoba. I know we have some challenges, and certainly many opportunities to work, all the stakeholders to work with the province of Manitoba in the coming 21st century. So we appreciate the commitment and we will forge forward. So thank you, Mr. Sims.
My pleasure.
Our next esteemed guest is Mr. Rick Frost. Rick is the CEO of Canada's first community foundation, the Winnipeg Foundation, which celebrates its centennial 100th year in 2021. And his leadership role he has held since 1997. The Winnipeg Foundation to all the PHAs has been a huge lifeline, and we love the foundation, and we are very interested to hear Mr. Frost's presentation. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate. As you've already mentioned, the Winnipeg Foundation is Canada's first community foundation, and so we are a proud part of Manitoba's heritage and obviously Canadian heritage as well. Our focus is on three things: endowment building, grant making, and community leadership. So the idea of talking about partnerships and sustainability is very much in our wheelhouse, and so I'm very glad to participate. We have a unique role. Our job is basically to give away money back to the community based on the gifts that people have provided in the past. And then in a typical year, the Winnipeg Foundation will support over 1,000 agencies or community charitable organizations in the full range of charitable activity, obviously including the heritage sector. By way of context, I want to say that there's 191 community foundations in Canada, and 55 are in Manitoba. So this reflects not only the generosity of our province, but I think also it's important to note the growing importance that the smaller community foundations across our province are going to be playing in future years. I want to talk a little bit about our grant making activity, because I know I've heard a lot this morning already about resources and that sort of thing, and probably it's important to talk just a few minutes about the kind of grants that we make, the scope of our activity. Basically, we have a range of grants. The first one I want to talk about is general community grants, where you're making an application to the foundation for support. Typical range of a grant is about $20,000. That's the normal kind of grant that we would see under this program. And for heritage, it would relate to things like preservation and restoration, special exhibits, archival projects, maybe modest equipment needs, that sort of thing. And good examples would be the restoration of stained glass windows at the Cathedral of Saints Vladimir and Olga, the United Church Archives for the Tulin residential school, sponsorships for events like this one that we're participating in. And of course, equipment would be the dehumidification system at the St. Boniface Historical Society. So aside from community grants, the foundation is involved in major capital grants, and some of them are not maybe so well known. We put $100,000 last year, for example, into the old Kildonan Church out in the cemetery in North Main, or maybe better known, the $1 million that we invested into the new Winnipeg exhibit at the Manitoba Museum. So major capital investments, generally defined as over $100,000. And then there's special initiatives that come out from time to time. And the most recent one, obviously, is COVID-19. In the last 6 months or so, we've spent about $12 to $13 million responding to COVID. Many historical heritage organizations have benefited from those programs. And that's sort of a special initiative, and we hope COVID is over pretty soon. So, but you know, we're sort of watching that very carefully and talking to people about it. Another example, maybe not so visible, of those kinds of special initiatives would be the investment that we made in the Millennium Center, where you're headquartered, for example, for this symposium. In the last 3 years, since 2017, we've invested over $200,000, I think, into roof repairs and general restoration work in that building. It's an important historic building, obviously, as Cindy's already indicated, and so it's sort of hard sometimes to get grants to spend money on that kind of work. And so the foundation is pleased to do that when we can. I do want to commend the province for the initiatives and the innovative approach that they've taken in the last couple of years on heritage project. It's hard to build capital. We're in the endowment building business, and we know it's hard to set capital. And I just looked on the chat line and someone said it's hard to build capital when we're trying to pay operational costs. And certainly we appreciate that. And so the kind of investment that the province has made is going to be there for a long time. Right now it's hard to do. 5 years from now, People look back and say it's pretty visionary, and 10 years from now, the province will be heroes for having created these endowments. And that's just the way endowment building kind of works. But basically, they're there to support heritage buildings, the cenotaphs, signature museums. The one I want to maybe talk a little bit about, because the minister did mention and made an announcement today that the Manitoba Heritage Trust program is being extended beyond the basic 3 years. And I think that that's a wonderful announcement. It does go to the point that it's going to help the museums that sort of help themselves. If you put money into an endowment, then it's going to get matched or stretched depending on the resources that are available each year. So it's there for the long run, and it's going to make a big difference. I want to thank Elliot for referencing the fact that we have invested in that program ourselves. We've set up endowments at $170,000 contributions for the Manitoba Historical Society, for the Archivists Association, for the Museums Association, Canada's History. Basically trying to get full advantage, to leverage those provincial dollars and take full advantage. So organizations that are sort of capacity building organizations across the whole sector will have some extra resources. And when those endowments are fully in place with the full provincial match that we'll expect to have by next March or so, they'll be generating between the four of them about $50,000 a year. So it's not huge, but it's sustainable. It's going to be there every single year, and I think that's a big issue, and certainly we've got the opportunity to grow. Already under the Manitoba Heritage Trust program, there's been 50 new endowments, and some of them are quite small. I quite admit they're small and they're just getting started, but over time, you plant a seed and eventually they start to really deliver significant fruit. And I'm very optimistic about the prospects that program offers. As I say, we've created 50 new endowments in the last 3 years. That's a pretty amazing base. Now what we have to do is grow those endowments over time. We're talking about seeding endowments and that sort of thing. We're really into the leadership side, not so much the endowment side or the grant making side, but you start to get into capacity building is really falling into the leadership side of the Winnipeg Foundation's work. And I could talk to many aspects there. Certainly one of the things I'm very enthusiastic about, which is probably on the edge of heritage a bit, but it's the public art that we've commissioned by Indigenous artists at the Forks. We've been involved with 4 of them. And obviously the Forks is one of the major heritage sites, and it's really important that Indigenous people feel comfortable there, and I'm really feeling good about those investments. We are also working with the university's archives program to try to help make sure that there's capacity. We've got $15,000 a year budgeted for an archivist student to work outside of the perimeter highway and in some of the smaller archives to try to get students out there. And there's a lot of work to be done with the Archives Association to be able to pull this off, but we're putting the money in place to hopefully support that kind of thing. And then lastly, I'll take just a few moments to talk about the new Centennial Institute that we've created as part of our Centennial, which happens in 2021, which is coming up soon. We've created a new entity within the Winnipeg Foundation called the Centennial Institute. It has a number of roles, or it will have a number of roles. Certainly we want to link the academic world into the heritage community side, and we'll be working on that. I've already mentioned trying to link the archives program at the University of Manitoba with community archives, and that would be an example of that. But one of the things that we have been putting in place is a pretty strong scholarship program. We've created in the last 4 years 11 new history scholarships for students in the master's program. For entrance level, they're $17,500 a year, which is nationally competitive. Doesn't matter if you go to McGill or Queens or wherever you go, you're not going to do better than $17,500. So we've created a number of those entrance level scholarships, and we've got a whole range of second year, more targeted scholarships, social history, women's history, Indigenous history, Black history, human rights, public health, history of public health. So we're putting in targeted scholarships as well, and they're paying between $7,000 and $8,500 a year, and putting the endowments behind them to make sure that they're there for the students long into the future. The Centennial Institute Steering Committee has not completed its work, so I can't say too much about exactly where the resources will go there, but I think based on the conversation, it's probably pretty fair to say that they're going to be focused to some extent on the untold stories. I think Canadian history is, at least in Manitoba, the way I look at it is it's pretty white, it's pretty colonial, and we're going to be looking at how do we tell more stories from more diverse backgrounds, maybe making some distinction, and my way of thinking about it is between Canada's history as Canada as a geographic entity and the people who live in Canada, the Canadians who come from all around the world. And how do those stories come together? And I think telling untold stories from our Indigenous perspective and from new Canadians, diverse Canadians, is going to be a piece that might characterize the work of the Centennial Institute to some extent, in addition to the student support that I've already referenced. So let me simply wrap up by saying that the Winnipeg Foundation's vision is a Winnipeg where community life flourishes for all. And the idea of a flourishing community without a flourishing heritage sector is pretty hard to imagine. So from our perspective, I think you can count on the Winnipeg Foundation to be there. We have a diverse range of programs. We're always looking for partnerships, and our job is sustainability. So certainly, again, I thank you for the opportunity to participate. It's been an interesting discussion so far, and I look forward to the balance of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. That was an amazing presentation, and I think just listening to you, I really realized the breadth of all the sectors that the Winnipeg Foundation helps, but certainly the heritage sector. I would be remiss if I didn't again say the Millennium Center is a building that we maintain as stewards, and maintenance is critical, and the Winnipeg Foundation has come in many times at the 11th hour to help us out when we needed matching funding. So that relationship affects all the PHAs. So again, thank you for an amazing presentation, Rick. And our final panelist today, our final speaker is Wins Bridgman. And Wins Bridgman, I've had the pleasure of working with for several decades. He is an award-winning heritage architect, leading community activist, and passionate champion of inclusive design and dignity for all. Wins has directed BridgmanCollaborative Architecture since its founding in 1998 and is a registered professional member of the Manitoba Association of Architects and Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. And I should note that his office is on the corner of Main and Higgins in the former Old Dominion Bank. So he knows a lot about heritage. So without further ado, Wins Bridgman.
Thank you, Cindy. Cindy, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. First of all, I'm so thankful to be part of this discussion. It has been a very enlightening, very enriching summit.
Sorry, Wins, we can't see your PowerPoint. We can just see you.
Oh, tell me how I can see. I have it on my screen.
You have to click on share on the bottom.
Okay, hold on. I'd get rid of here and share screen. Okay. Now my screen is here. Do you see it now?
I can pull it up.
We can pull it. Oh, there we have it, Wins.
Oh,
okay, we have it here centrally, so you don't worry about it. Just let us know when to move forward.
Oh, thank you so much. So can I see? Good, perfect. Today, what I wanted to do was to, as a practitioner, I'm able to work with different communities over decades, as Cindy had mentioned. And one of the things that we get to see is how partnerships can affect a series of decisions within the community as people develop literacy about economic sustainability and partnerships. And what that often entails is what I call the unlikely partnerships, the ones where people have to work together, where there are different people are coming from different points of view. And so we're going to look right now at the Barber House and how that has affected the development of North Point Douglas, and in fact, the future of how we look at heritage in that area. Now, about 10 years ago, when we were first involved with Barber House, there were a number of people who felt that Barber House represented a settler type of building. And of course, it was an 1863 building for the Barber family. And what we began with is this wonderful statement from the Borough Charter that we all have loved. See, if you just see if the first, did you go back up to the Borough Charter, please? Go down one slide. No, go the other direction, please. Thank you. And really what it says is the coexistence of cultural values should always be recognized, respected, and encouraged. And that was really, and that's especially when there is conflict. And I think that that's really where we begin on this case study to show how that worked through. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So North Point Douglas is one of the first areas of settlement in Winnipeg, and Point Douglas is very close to the downtown. It's an area that is surrounded as a peninsula surrounded by the Red River. It is an area that it has industrial elements. It has traditionally working class housing, and it has a very strong community of people with a higher level of Indigenous population of about 31%, the highest level of women-led households in Winnipeg. Next slide, please. And in that building, in that area, was one of the first buildings, which is really was residential. It was a farm building. It was the Barber House, and you can see it in this rendering. Next slide. And it was until 1974, it was occupied by the Barber family or by other people who leased from the Barber family. In 1974, next slide, there were a series of fires, and the fires lasted until 2011. And the number of fires is maybe 4, maybe 5. But the issue of arson is an important one to recognize. Where a building is not being used, whether it's not being cared for, or whether it is not part of the fabric of a community, it is often vandalized. And here we had Barber House that in some ways represented the very beginning of the community, and on the other hand, it appeared as though it was a derelict building, a building that had no value. So next slide, please. And really at the point that we came in 2010, there were a number of different groups who were vying for this area where the Barber House was located. One was a group called Sistars. And Sistars was a group of women for social justice that wanted a hub that would represent the community's aspirations. To do this, there was a hope to have a child care center and to have the other areas like coffee shops, laundromats, and a general community hub for seniors and so on in that area. They were concerned, however, as we began to look at the Barber House site, the Barber House restoration would take away funds from the community project. Also, City of Winnipeg, in their wisdom, had dumped tons of soil that was led on this land. And there was also a summer kitchen that had been demolished previously, but was a key part of this restoration. Another partner was the child care program that agreed to a child care on the Barber site for the community, but did not want to be connected to community the community hub for safety reasons and programmatic reasons. But nevertheless, there was a concern in terms of funding. And finally, there was the City of Winnipeg, Heritage Winnipeg, and the province of Manitoba that were interested in interpreting Barber House in the broadest way possible for North Point Douglas as of the building and as the founders, in many ways, one of the founding families of Winnipeg. So there were 3 tensions that were there there were 3 stakeholders with a number of tensions. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the Barber House, this was the site, and you can see where the Barber House is essentially, and we now had the funding to be able to put a child care. So the question then is, how do you work with stakeholders? How do you then really believe that you can Around the table you can talk, but also you can talk in actions. You could have put the childcare as far away from the barber house as possible because it's too problematic to try to connect the two together. It's one problem and it's another problem. Or you can say this is a community issue and that partnerships are about solving difficult issues together. Next slide. And oh my goodness, we put the building right up against the barber house. Now what that meant was that there was a $1.4 million building that was being built in front of essentially a pile of sticks. Now that created a tension for all the partners, and it meant that we needed to talk together and bring in as many different kinds of stakeholders as possible. Next slide. And we needed to make sure the community was on side. So we were talking about the nature of the childcare, and you can see the barber house ruins in the background. But we saw it as the community hub and the childcare working together in North Point Douglas. Next slide. The Winnipeg Foundation, among its many, many things that it did that were quite wonderful, it included money to help the community be able to get other funders. It's complex to bring everybody on the same page. It's difficult when there are different partnerships to be able to agree on a project. We were able to get 10 funders together with the community. Now this required a community literacy. It required an agreement that there were a lot of compromises that needed to occur and that there were people out there that could help a community to develop its vision. Okay, so the exciting thing was to say, look at all these people who are becoming part of the community project and look at the way we then can begin to resolve it on the ground. Next slide. So yes, we had the pictures. We began to imagine how all the barber house could be integrated, how the summer kitchen could become a place that unified feasts for the community, how the barber house could, although it was a settler building, could also be integrated into the Eagle Wing Child Care Center, which had all kinds of Indigenous roots and was training Indigenous child care workers at that time. Next slide. And we had to have an image of what it was that we were all working together for. And sometimes an image is in numbers, and sometimes an image of what we all share together is very real. It's something that we can touch. And in this case, it was the Red River construction. And these logs had been floated down the Red River. It had been, the barber house had been built in the Red River construction style. And it was, in a way, it was saying, these are our history. Oh, but it wasn't the only history. Those same logs had been scarified by 4 or 5 fires that had represented the distress of the community. Next slide. Those logs were taken, that picture was taken in this building, standing on this rubble. So we had to figure out a way to satisfy the desire for a beautiful building that becomes a landmark and has always been a landmark in the community that would reach forward into our own futures. We had to also express the distress of the community, and we had to make a hub that was related to the child care center. Next slide. So in a very pragmatic way, we had to value the wood. It was as though the wood itself became the thing that we could all understand together. And it was all in kind of twisted shape. So we said, this wood is now just a veneer. We built a steel frame around the building. We insulated it. We turned it then on the outside to look like, next slide. Like, oh, here we are building around the wood log. So next slide, please. And so it began to look very similar to this initial painting that I showed you. But on the interior, next slide, please, we were able to represent the logs. And this became the place where there were community meetings for a decade and continue, we hope, into the future. And I should note that the heritage elements in it in some ways, the fires allowed more versatility and freedom in the way we would interpret this building. But it's important that as we look at these logs, that we don't see it only at one time in history, but we see it as a group of partnerships over time. Next slide. 10 years go by, and this is 10 years of the community seeing a beautiful heritage restored building that glows in their neighborhood. During that time, crime has decreased in North Point Douglas, and community groups have grown, whether it be the Mama Bear Clan, whether it be MICEC, at that point it was Nietzsche, and now it's Scope, and of course the Women's Center. And we were hired to look at what were the next ideas and plans by the PDRC, which is the Residents Association, in terms of heritage in North Point Douglas. And we wanted to listen to people. Next slide. And we began with the indigenous populations, and then we went on to many different groups to ask at each different area, each different group, what their vision was. And increasingly, it was understood that we wanted to have safety, but we also wanted to keep the neighborhood with the qualities it had at the present time. And that meant not pushing indigenous people who were renters and maybe lower income out of the area. It meant celebrating the long history of the radical women-led households that had shaped for so many years North Point Douglas. It meant that the buildings that belonged to the heritage and were often working class buildings in the neighborhood were valued. And this became important because the area of North Point Douglas will be gentrified. It's an area close to the downtown. It's surrounded by water. It is really a wonderful neighborhood. And the community was asking now, how do we preserve the nature of our heritage, of our neighborhood? And one of the things that was extraordinary about working first in the Barber House and then within the community, next slide please, was that when we were talking about larger partnerships of how we could imagine a different form of development and gentrification where indigenous people were not pushed out further and further from the city core, where there could be increased housing projects where different levels of economic growth would occur, where we could have a heritage conservation district within North Point Douglas that was not for rich people, but it was for people with as little red tape as possible to be able to keep in their neighborhoods, that people were able to trust in these kinds of partnerships. Next slide, please. And so I think that the point of our discussion and why I believe that it's sometimes important to come back to a case study is that we work in heritage over time. We build trust in a process of heritage. We work with communities who are part of our heritage. And I believe that the economic sustainability of our communities is when we practice careful partnerships, where we listen to one another as we did, as we are encouraged to by the borough, whatever it is, the ICOMOS statements, to really be able to be, and I think what we've all said this morning, inclusive, respecting its diversity, and providing trust in partnerships over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wins. That was a wonderful presentation and certainly meant a lot to me for you to go through this, because Barber House was certainly a testament to the tenacity for the North Point Douglas community and stakeholders. So thank you very much, Wins. We're running a little late, so I think, to be fair, we have one quick question if it's possible. We will be monitoring the chat as stated earlier, so we will not forget about you. We just don't have a lot of time. So I do have a question for Rick Frost. Is the Winnipeg Foundation restricted to the city, or can the rural areas apply? Oh, can you unmute your audio?
You're muted, Rick.
There we go. Gotcha. Sorry about that, folks. The Winnipeg Foundation has a program called Endow Manitoba, which is really works, the focus of that team of 5 people is outside the perimeter highway. And they're involved with the other 54, 55 community foundations supporting them. As I said in my comments, the other foundations are becoming stronger every year. It's amazing to see their growth. It's interesting, I compared their growth collectively to ours at the Winnipeg Foundation, and interestingly, the rural foundations in Manitoba are actually growing faster than we are. So we sort of watch that with a degree of interest, obviously. But they are really supporting their rural communities, and we're not trying to be the Manitoba Community Foundation. We are the Winnipeg Foundation. We use Endow Manitoba as our answer to that. The Manitoba Heritage Trust Program does warrant a special comment, though, and that is because that is a provincially mandated program. We are running that program out of the Endow Manitoba team, and heritage organizations in both Winnipeg and Manitoba, broadly in Manitoba, outside the perimeter highway, can all apply. As I said, we've got 50 endowments already. I know that the minister has said it's being extended. And I'm sure that Elliot will be, and people at the province will be issuing more information about how that extension is going to work. The current phase lasts until the end of March, and so we've got lots of time, but it's fabulous news that it's being extended, and it'll be inclusive of all parts of the province.
Thank you very much, Rick. And I'd just like to take a quick opportunity to thank all our speakers this morning. They were very detailed, went into a lot of the current issues that we face. And again, on behalf of all the PHAs and the Manitoba Heritage Summit, thank you very much to all our panelists this morning. I'll give it back to Sheldon.
And I'm here simply to say that we are going to take a break for lunch now. We're short of time, so we're going to try and come back for 1 o'clock, folks. Okay, so step away from your computer for a little bit, but come back at 1. Looking forward to the afternoon, and thanks everyone for the morning.